A junior officer approached, bowing with a mix of deference and unease. "Admiral, the human envoy has arrived aboard the Parley. They request an audience to discuss terms of surrender." Drather's lips curled into a predatory smile. "Terms? They still believe they have leverage? Very well. Bring him to the command chamber. Let's hear this final authority grovel." The officer nodded and retreated. Behind Drather, Lieutenant Adrian Vex, the Admiral's chief strategist, shifted uneasily. Unlike his superior, Vex found no joy in the theatrics of victory. His sharp mind thrived on precision and order, and something about this envoy's timing felt wrong. "The humans are desperate," Drather sneered, sensing Vex's hesitation. What could they possibly achieve now? Vex hesitated. "Desperation, Admiral, is precisely what makes them dangerous." Drather dismissed the remark with a wave of his hand. Moments later, the chamber doors slid open and Oliver Washington entered. He was unremarkable at first glance. Average height, neatly combed brown hair, and a face that seemed built to fade into a crowd. He wore a simple dark suit, his only adornment a silver pin shaped like Earth's insignia. His gait was steady, his eyes calm. Too calm. "Oliver Washington," he introduced himself, his voice carrying a quiet confidence. "Representative of Earth's unified command." He inclined his head slightly, not a bow but a calculated gesture of acknowledgement. Drather leaned forward, studying Washington like a predator, sizing up unfamiliar prey. "You arrive late to the funeral, Washington. Earth is ash. Your fleet is scattered. What terms could you possibly offer that would interest the Empire?" Washington's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I'm not here to offer terms, Admiral. I'm here to remind you of rule number 1. The chamber fell silent. Drather's brow furrowed. "Rule number 1? Another of your quaint human slogans." Washington's expression remained unreadable. "Not quite. Rule number 1 is a principle, one that transcends battles and empires. It's about survival, and about how underestimating humanity tends to end poorly for those who do." Drather barked a laugh, the sound echoing in the vast chamber. "Arrogance, even in defeat. Charming. But this charade is wasting my time." Vex's voice cut through the tension, sharp and measured. "Admiral, if I may, this envoy should not be dismissed so quickly. Humans have proven resourceful before. Their survival of the Mars offensive was—" "An anomaly," Drather interrupted, annoyance flaring in his tone. "This is different. This is final." Washington tilted his head, observing the interplay with quiet interest. He seemed almost amused. "You think you've won because you've shattered our cities and silenced our signals. But you've misunderstood something fundamental about us." "And what's that?" Drather asked, his patience wearing thin. "That we don't play by your rules," Washington replied. His voice was soft, but it carried a weight that stilled the room. "You see humanity as fractured, chaotic, unpredictable. And you're right. That's why you lost before you ever started." Drather rose from his seat, towering over Washington. "Careful, envoy. Your defiance borders on suicidal. You stand here only because I allow it." Washington met his gaze without flinching. "And you're here, Admiral, because we wanted you to be—" A ripple of unease passed through the officers in the chamber. Drather's eyes narrowed, but Vex spoke first. "What are you implying?" "Simply that the Empire's perception of control is flawed," Washington said. "Your victories are built on predictable strategies, overwhelming force, and an assumption of superiority. But you've overlooked something critical. The holographic map flickered, a minor glitch, but enough to draw glances." Drather's voice was low and menacing. "If this is a threat, Washington, it's a poor one." Washington didn't react. "Not a threat, Admiral. Just an observation. You see, while you were busy parading your strength, humanity was preparing for the inevitable. We knew we couldn't win by fighting your war. So, we fought ours. The lights dim momentarily. This time, The unease was palpable. Vex stepped closer to the central console, his fingers dancing over the controls. "Admiral, there's a disruption in the ship systems. It's localized but spreading." Drather's fist slammed the table. "What is this?" Washington adjusted his cuffs, his calm demeanor unbroken. "Rule number 1. Never underestimate humanity's ability to adapt. You might have destroyed our fleets and burned our cities, but the war isn't over. It was never over." Drather's face twisted with rage. "You dare—" "Admiral," Vex interrupted, his voice urgent. "Multiple breaches in the system. Communications are down. Internal defenses are compromised. This isn't a glitch. It's sabotage." Washington stepped back, folding his hands behind his back. "You assumed the battlefield was only in space. But humanity's greatest strength has always been its ability to think outside the lines you draw." Drather's eyes burned with fury, but behind it, there was something else. Doubt. For the first time in the campaign, the invincible admiral of the Galactic Empire looked uncertain. "You still believe you can win," he snarled. Washington inclined his head, his expression unchanging. "Winning isn't always about strength, Admiral. Sometimes it's about making sure your opponent realizes they've already lost." As the chamber's alarms began to blare, Washington turned toward the doors. "I suggest you prepare for what's coming next. It's been a pleasure meeting you." The envoy left, the doors sliding shut behind him. Drather stood frozen, his knuckles white against the table. Vex worked furiously at the console, but the chaos in the system was spreading too fast. For the first time in his career, Drather felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Fear. In the cold silence that followed, Vex looked up, his voice trembling. "Admiral, what if he's right?" Drather didn't answer. He couldn't. Oliver Washington's footsteps echoed through the narrow corridors of the Empire's flagship as he made his way back to the parley. The sleek, metallic walls hummed faintly with energy, an oppressive reminder of the Empire's technological superiority. Washington's expression was inscrutable, but his mind was a storm of calculations. Everything depended on timing now. As he stepped aboard his shuttle, he was greeted by Dr. Samuel Harker, a wiry man in his late 50s with sharp features and piercing green eyes. Harker was a physicist by training, but his mind worked like a blade, cutting through problems with relentless precision. "How did it go?" Harker asked, his voice tinged with curiosity and concern. "They bought it," Washington replied, settling into his seat as the shuttle began its journey back to the human fleet's hidden staging ground. "Drather thinks he's in control, but the cracks are starting to show. Vex is a real wild card. He's smarter than the rest of them and suspicious. We'll need to move faster than planned." Harker's lips pressed into a thin line. "And the systems—" "In place," Washington assured him. "Their flagship is compromised. All that's left is to push the right buttons." The shuttle descended into silence, the hum of its engines the only sound. Washington leaned back, closed his eyes for a brief moment. He allowed himself a flicker of memory. A quiet night years ago, standing on the balcony of a ruined building overlooking the ashes of Paris. That was when the plan had been born. Not out of hope, but necessity. It had been a moment of grim realization. Humanity could not match the Empire in strength or resources, but they didn't need to. They only needed to exploit the Empire's weaknesses. Its arrogance, its over-reliance on centralized systems, and its inability to anticipate the unpredictable. Harker's voice broke through his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder, Oliver, if we've gone too far? If there was another way?" Washington opened his eyes, fixing Harker with a steady gaze. "There was no other way. You saw what they did to Mars, to Earth. The Empire doesn't negotiate, it consumes. If we didn't fight back, there would be nothing left." Harker nodded slowly, but doubt lingered in his expression. Washington didn't blame him. The weight of their choices was a heavy burden to bear. The shuttle docked with the Parley, a sleek, stealth-equipped vessel that had become humanity's secret weapon. Its design was a blend of human ingenuity and scavenged Empire technology, a testament to Earth's resourcefulness. As they stepped into the ship's command center, they were greeted by Commander Julian Pierce, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence. Pierce wasted no time. We received updates from the infiltration teams. They report full operational control over the flagship's critical systems. The sabotage protocols are ready to activate on your command. Washington nodded, his expression grim. Good. We need to keep the pressure on. The longer Drafter and his crew are distracted by internal problems, the less prepared they'll be for what's coming. Pierce crosses arms, his jaw tightening. And what about the fleet? They're eager to strike, but if we reveal ourselves too early, they'll crush us, Washington finished. I know. Timing is everything. We wait until the flagship is in chaos, then hit them with everything we've got. Harker stepped forward. And if the flagship doesn't collapse as planned? Washington's gaze hardened. Then we improvise. But trust me, Samuel, the Empire's strength is also its greatest weakness. They've never had to face an enemy who could match them in ingenuity. That's where we win. The tension in the room was palpable. Every man aware of the stakes. Humanity was gambling everything on this plan, and failure meant extinction. Washington turned to the holographic display at the center of the room, where the Empire's fleet was represented in chilling detail. At the heart of the formation was the flagship, its size dwarfing the rest of the ships around it. It was both a symbol of the Empire's dominance and a critical vulnerability. Admiral Drather thinks he's invincible, Washington said, his voice cutting through the room. But he's forgotten the first rule of war. The moment you believe you've won, you've already lost. Pierce's lips curled into a grim smile. Let's remind him, then. Washington's fingers danced over the console, sending encrypted commands to the infiltration teams embedded within the flagship. These teams, composed of Earth's finest engineers and hackers, had spent months preparing for this moment. Their work was invisible but devastating, like termites hollowing out a mighty tree. As the first stage of the plan unfolded, Washington turned to Harker. Is the fallback ready? Harker nodded. If the Empire retaliates, we have contingencies in place. But I don't need to tell you, Oliver, that this is a one-shot gamble. If anything goes wrong, it won't, Washington interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. We've planned for every variable. This isn't just a battle, it's a message. Humanity doesn't kneel. Harker's gaze lingered on Washington for a moment before he sighed. Let's hope they hear it loud and clear. Time passed in a tense blur. The command center was a hive of activity, each officer focused on their tasks with laser precision. Washington monitored the operation's progress, his mind a whirlwind of strategies and contingencies. Then, a message came through. Sabotage protocols activated. Internal systems compromised. The flagship is vulnerable. Washington allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Phase 1 is complete. Prepare for Phase 2. Pierce barked orders, his voice carrying across the room. The fleet was on standby, hidden in the shadow of a nearby moon. At Washington's command, they would strike with surgical precision, targeting the Empire's key vessels while avoiding collateral damage. As Washington watched the holographic display, a flicker of doubt crossed his mind. He pushed it aside. Doubt had no place here, not when the stakes were this high. Send the signal, he said, his voice steady. Harker hesitated. Are you sure? Washington met his gaze. This is what we've been fighting for. It's time. The room fell silent as the signal was sent. In the distance, the hidden human fleet began to move, emerging from the moon's shadow like predators closing in on their prey. The Empire's sensors would detect them soon, but by then, it would be too late. As the operation entered its final stage, Washington turned to the holographic map. The Empire's formation was unraveling, their arrogance blinding them to the danger until it was too late. Let's remind them why humanity survived, Washington said quietly. The command center erupted into controlled chaos as the fleet launched its assault. Washington stood at the center of it all, his gaze unwavering. This was humanity's moment, and he would see it through to the end. The Empire's flagship, Dominion's Wrath, was a fortress among stars, a marvel of engineering that embodied the Galactic Empire's supremacy. Its hull bristled with weaponry capable of annihilating fleets, its shields impervious to almost all known forms of attack. But in that moment, it was a ship on edge. Admiral Cale Drather stormed through the command deck, his polished boots striking the floor like hammer blows. The alarms blared, and the once pristine efficiency of his crew had descended into chaos. Screens flickered erratically, critical systems failed to respond, and reports of sabotage poured in from every section. "Get me answers," Drather roared, his voice cutting through the din. "I want this ship under control now." Lieutenant Adrian Vex stood at his console, his fingers flying over the interface as he attempted to restore order. Sweat glistened on his brow, but his movements were precise, driven by a mind that thrived on complexity. "Admiral, the disruptions are spreading faster than we can contain them. Whoever's behind this knew exactly where to hit us." Drather turned on him, his eyes blazing. "Are you saying this human envoy is responsible? That one man managed to bring my ship to its knees?" Vex's jaw tightened. "It's not just him. This is a coordinated attack. Their infiltrators have compromised our systems, and they've exploited vulnerabilities we didn't even know existed." Drather's hand slammed onto the console beside him, his frustration mounting. "Then find them. Purge them. I will not have my command reduced to a spectacle for a lesser species." Before Vex could respond, the ship shuddered violently. Lights flickered, and a tremor ran through the deck as if the ship itself were groaning in pain. A new alert blared across the room. "Admiral," an officer shouted, "human fleet detected. They've broken formation and are advancing on our position." Drather froze, his mind racing. The humans should have been scattered, defeated. Yet now they were attacking with precision and confidence. The timing was no coincidence. This was the next phase of their plan. "Prepare all weapons," Drather commanded, his voice a mix of anger and resolve. "They'll regret this audacity." But even as the flagship's weapons began to power up, another tremor rocked the ship. This one was sharper, more deliberate. Vex's eyes darted to his console, and his stomach sank as he read the data. "Admiral, we've lost control of the primary targeting systems. Secondary power grids are offline. The sabotage is more extensive than we realized," Vex reported grimly. Drather's hands clenched into fists. "Then override it. I don't care what it takes, Lieutenant. Restore orders." The command deck erupted into frantic activity, but there was no hiding the growing panic. Drather's officers, so accustomed to the Empire's unassailable dominance, were ill-prepared for the chaos they now faced. Meanwhile, aboard the Parley, Oliver Washington watched the unfolding events with a calm intensity. The human fleet had launched its assault, but Washington knew this was not just a test of firepower. It was a test of strategy, of nerve. "Status?" Washington asked, his voice even. Commander Julian Pierce, standing beside him, grinned grimly. "The flagship is in disarray. Their weapons are compromised, and their defensive formation is falling apart. The fleet is ours for the taking." "Not yet," Washington replied. "Drather isn't the type to surrender. He'll fight to the bitter end, and desperate men are the most dangerous." Pierce nodded, his confidence tempered by experience. "Then what's the play?" Washington studied the holographic map, where the Empire's fleet scrambled to respond to the human assault. "We keep them off balance, hit their weak points, force them to spread their forces thin. And when the flagship is vulnerable, he let the sentence hang, the implication clear." Pierce's grin returned, sharper this time. "Understood. Let's make them bleed." Back on Dominion's Wrath, the situation was spiraling out of control. Drather's commands grew more frantic, his once unshakable authority eroding with every failure. The ship shuddered again, this time from an external impact. Directed to the port side, an officer called out. Shields are holding, but barely. Drafter's face darkened. Turn the ship to face the enemy fleet. I want all remaining weapons focused on their flagship. Vex hesitated. Admiral, with our targeting systems down, that maneuver will leave us vulnerable. I gave you an order, Lieutenant. Drafter snapped, his voice a thunderclap of fury. Vex stiffened, then returned to his console, his expression grim. He knew the maneuver was reckless, but defiance was not an option. The ship began to turn, its massive bulk straining under the coordinated fire of the human fleet. As the flagship repositioned, the humans shifted their strategy, targeting key escort ships and further destabilizing the Empire's formation. Amid the chaos, Vex's mind worked furiously. He couldn't ignore the patterns emerging before him. The humans weren't just fighting. They were dismantling the Empire's doctrine, exploiting its rigidity and overconfidence. Admiral, Vex said, his voice steady despite the tension. This isn't a conventional attack. They're not trying to destroy us outright. They're forcing us into mistakes, exploiting our weaknesses. Drafter shot him a glare. Then adapt. Show them why the Empire is supreme. But even as Drafter barked orders, Vex's unease deepened. The humans' tactics were too precise, too calculated. This wasn't just about the flagship. It was about sending a message. And then it happened. A final tremor rocked the ship, followed by a deafening explosion. The lights flickered, and a wave of heat rolled through the deck as fire suppression systems struggled to contain the damage. Report, Drafter demanded, his voice strained. Critical damage to the engineering bay. An officer replied. We've lost propulsion and auxiliary power. We're dead in the water. Drafter's face contorted with rage, but before he could respond, Vex spoke. Admiral, we need to consider the possibility of retreat. If we continue, retreat, Drafter spat the word like poison. The Empire does not retreat. We will fight to the last man if we must. Vex's expression hardened. And what then, Admiral? A glorious death? Or would you rather live to understand how we were beaten? Drafter's glare bore into him. But there was no time to argue. The human fleet closed in, their firepower relentless. Washington's voice echoed in Drafter's mind, a chilling reminder of rule number 1. Never underestimate humanity. As the flagship systems failed and its crew struggled to maintain control, the reality of their situation became undeniable. The unthinkable had happened. The Empire's greatest weapon was crumbling, not from overwhelming force, but from within. Drafter's fists clenched at his sides, his pride warring with the cold logic of survival. The battle was lost, but the war might yet be salvaged if he lived to fight another day. Order the fleet to regroup, Drafter said at last, his voice heavy with reluctant acceptance. We'll fall back and reassess. Vex nodded, his respect for the Admiral tempered by a bitter truth. The Empire's invincibility had been shattered, and the humans had proven that even the mightiest can fall. The battlefield stretched across the void, an intricate tapestry of chaos and light. The Empire's flagship, Dominion's Wrath, hung battered and vulnerable, its once impervious hull scarred and smoking. The human fleet, smaller but relentless, encircled the behemoth like wolves stalking a wounded beast. On the parley, Oliver Washington stood in the command center, his face illuminated by the glow of the holographic display. Every movement of the fleet, every attack and counterattack, played out before him like a deadly chess game. The weight of his decisions pressed down on him, but his voice remained steady. Commander Pierce, deploy squadrons 4 through 7 to the flagship's starboard flank. Keep them engaged, but don't overcommit. We're not here for glory. We're here to finish this. Pierce nodded sharply. Understood. They'll be pinned. Dr. Harker, who had been monitoring the sabotage team's progress, approached Washington with a grim expression. We've hit their reactor controls, but they've initiated manual overrides. If we're going to take this ship down, it won't be through sabotage alone. Washington's jaw tightened. He had anticipated resistance, but the Empire's resolve was formidable. Then we'll do it the old-fashioned way. Focus all fire on their critical systems. We take out their weapons and propulsion. They'll have no choice but to surrender or burn. As Pierce relayed the orders, Washington turned his attention back to the display. His mind raced, calculating probabilities and contingencies. He could feel the eyes of his crew on him, their trust in him unwavering despite the odds. He couldn't afford to fail them. On Dominion's raft, Admiral Drather stood at the center of his collapsing world. The command deck was in disarray, smoke curling from damaged consoles, the air thick with tension and desperation. His officers worked feverishly, but the gap between their efforts and the ship's deteriorating state grew wider by the second. Admiral, the human fleet is targeting our engines and weapon systems. Shields are down at 23% and failing, Lieutenant Vex reported, his voice strained but composed. Drather's fists clenched, his pride and fury warring with the cold logic of the situation. He had always believed in the Empire's unassailable superiority, but the humans had shown him otherwise. They had turned their weakness into strength, their desperation into ingenuity. Redirect all available power to the engines, Drather ordered. We need to break their formation and escape. If we stay here, we're finished. Vex hesitated, then nodded. Understood, Admiral. As the flagship struggled to turn, Washington observed the maneuver from the parley. A flicker of satisfaction crossed his face. Drather was predictable in his desperation. They're trying to retreat, Washington said. But we can't let them regroup. Pierce, deploy interceptors to cut off their escape vector, and prepare the boarding teams. If Drather won't surrender, we'll take that ship ourselves. Pierce raised an eyebrow. A bold move. Washington met his gaze. This isn't just about winning the battle. It's about sending a message. The Empire needs to know they're not untouchable anymore. Pierce's grin returned. I'll make it happen. As the human fleet tightened its grip, Drather's frustration boiled over. He slammed a fist onto the console, his voice rising above the chaos. How is this possible? How have these primitives outmaneuvered us at every turn? Vex's gaze was steady as he responded. Because they're not primitives, Admiral. They've adapted, learned, and prepared. They've turned our arrogance against us. Drather glared at him, but before he could reply, the ship shuddered violently. The lights flickered and an alarm blared, signaling critical damage to the propulsion systems. They've disabled our engines, an officer shouted. Drather's face darkened. Prepare the self-destruct sequence. If we cannot win, we will deny them the satisfaction of taking this ship. Vex's eyes widened. Admiral, that would kill everyone on board. Drather's gaze was unyielding. A necessary sacrifice. The Empire's strength lies in its image. We cannot allow these humans to tarnish it. Before Drather could issue the final command, a tremor ran through the deck. A new alert appeared on Vex's console, and his expression turned grim. Admiral, we've been boarded. On the lower decks, Washington led the boarding party with cold precision. Dressed in tactical armor and armed with cutting-edge weapons, the human soldiers moved like shadows through the Empire's corridors. Washington's own movements were deliberate, every step calculated. Stay sharp, Washington said, his voice low but commanding. We're here to take the ship, not to lose men unnecessarily. The resistance was fierce, but the Empire's soldiers were demoralized, their usual discipline eroded by the chaos. Washington's team advanced methodically, disabling critical systems and securing key positions. As they approached the command deck, Washington turned to his second-in-command, a wiry soldier named Ethan Cross. This is it. Once we're in, we take control. No unnecessary casualties. Cross nodded. Understood, sir. The doors to the command deck slid open, and Washington stepped inside, his weapon raised. The room fell silent, the clash of steel and fire replaced by a tense stillness. Drather stood at the center of the room, his once proud posture now weighed down by exhaustion and defeat. He met Washington's gaze with a mixture of fury and begrudging respect. "So, this is the face of humanity's defiance," Drather said, his voice laced with venom. Washington lowered his weapon slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "And you're the face of the Empire's arrogance. Tell me, Admiral, how does it feel to lose?" Drather's fist clenched, but he remained silent. Washington took a step closer, his voice steady and cold. "You've underestimated us at every turn. You thought we were weak, insignificant, but humanity doesn't bow. We adapt, we endure, and we fight back." Drather's glare softened, replaced by something resembling grudging admiration. "You've proven yourselves formidable, Washington, but don't mistake this for victory. The Empire will never fall." Washington's lips curved into a faint, grim smile. "We don't need to bring down the Empire. We just need to show the galaxy that it can bleed." Drather's shoulders sagged as the weight of his failure settled over him. For the first time, he looked less like an unshakable symbol of power and more like a man facing the limits of his own hubris. The room was silent as Washington extended a hand. "Surrender, Admiral. End this now, and we can avoid more bloodshed. Humanity's fight isn't with your people. It's with the tyranny you represent." Drather hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his situation. Finally, he reached out, his hand trembling as it met Washington's. "You've won this battle," Drather said, his voice low. "But the war is far from over." Washington's expression was unreadable as he replied, "Then we'll see you on the battlefield." As the human fleet secured the flagship and the Empire's forces retreated, a new dawn broke over the galaxy. The humans had shown that even the mightiest could fall, that courage and ingenuity could triumph over tyranny. And as Oliver Washington stood on the bridge of the parley, watching the stars stretch out before him, he felt a flicker of hope. Humanity had survived. Humanity had prevailed. And now, the galaxy would never forget rule number 1.